So in lab, you saw that the muscular system can be incredibly complex. And so the purpose of this web lecture is to help you to sort and organize the large number of muscles found particularly in mammals, and to be able to group them by functional group and by their evolutionary origin to make sense of this very complicated large number of muscles we see in vertebrate bodies. So let's begin our story as we always do with the differentiation of mesoderm. So recall that just after gastrulation, when the mesoderm first begins to differentiate, we begin with these long rods of mesoderm tissue alongside the notochord and later the neural tube when it develops, known as paraxial mesoderm. That paraxial mesoderm condenses to form little balls of tissue from that single rod called somites. And the somites then divide into three component parts: myotome, sclerotome, and dermatome. And the myotome is what's going to give rise to both the axial musculature of the body and also the appendicular musculature of the body, so the limb musculature. So basically everything we're going to be talking about at this point is based on the myotome division of these somites. So again, we're talking about segmental structures, and we're going to take a closer look at that segmentation as we start to think about this in fish. So in fish, these repeating units of axial musculature are known as myomeres, and they are responsible for producing the lateral bends associated with locomotion. So remember, fish primarily use their entire body bending back and forth to propel themselves through the water. In gnathostome fish, these myomeres are separated into an apaxial section dorsally and a hypaxial section ventrally, separated by this horizontal skeletogenous septum. So we saw this septum in a developmental context when we were looking at the development of the vertebral column. So you'll remember this image from the web lecture on ribs and vertebrae. And there's this whole series of these skeletogenous septa that help to guide and direct the development of these axial structures. So remember that these segments are determined by somites. So one somite for each of these segments. Remember, the vertebrae are intersegmental structures, so we've got the posterior part of one somite contributing to one part of this vertebra, and then the anterior part of the next one, which you can't see, hidden behind this septum here. And so here in this gnathostome, we've got the horizontal septum that's going to separate the apaxial musculature from the hypaxial musculature. And then there are all these myosepta that are separating the different segments. And these are going to be the tendons to which these segmental body muscles are going to attach. So these little sections in here that are separated by the myosepta and also separated apaxial from hypaxial by the horizontal septum. These little sections are going to fill in with these body muscles. So in jawless fish such as the lamprey here, this takes a very, very simple form. So these blocks are just filled in with very simple muscle tissue spanning from one segment to the next. Remember, in non-gnathostome vertebrates, there's no horizontal septum, no division between apaxial and hypaxial musculature. So we just get these blocks of muscles filling in these myomeres and pulling just on a single segment at a time. When you get into more derived gnathostomes, you can get very complicated foldings of these myomeres into these intricate shapes. So some have a V shape and some have this more derived W shape, like this teleost. And what that allows them to do is have these myomeres cross more than one body segment as they fold in this elaborate way, and that allows them to have even greater control over their lateral bendings. And so when you are looking at your nice salmon fillets, what you're actually seeing are these sort of cone-shaped structures overlapping each other, so nested inside one another. These kind of rings are multiple slices through a bunch of these different folded myomeres that you see in more derived fish. So the muscular system in the fish is really pretty simple. So Basically, these segmental body muscles, these axial muscles repeating, nested one within the other. Here you see this horizontal septum separating appaxial muscles above from hypaxial muscles below. In the fins, there is a single abductor to elevate the fin, a single adductor to depress the fin. Sometimes there are slips of these muscle masses that help to rotate the fins, but it's basically just one for up and one for down in both the pectoral and the pelvic appendage. Really, really simple. But things start to get a little bit more complicated when we move into life on land. In the appaxial muscles, they don't get very much more complicated right away. So remember that early tetrapods and also things like living salamanders still primarily move by lateral undulations of the body. So these appaxial muscles still retain this very simple segmented structure that's primarily adapted for producing these lateral bends of the body. And as we go into more derived tetrapods, such as this mammal, the rabbit, what we start to see is a lot more differentiation of these appaxial muscles. Instead of having these segmental blocks of muscles, the muscles become very elongate, particularly in mammals. These help with those dorsoventral bends of the body to be able to cross many vertebral segments. There are also smaller slips of muscles that cross fewer segments, but you see a lot more specialization, specialized muscles for controlling the head and neck, such as the splenius muscle, but mostly these kind of elongated muscles that cross multiple vertebral segments. Now, turning to think about the hypaxial muscles, when we move from water to land, the biological role of these muscles changes entirely. So instead of having the primary role in locomotion and producing lateral bending, now these muscles have to support all of this internal viscera, the body organs, against the pull of gravity as the body is pushed up onto these limbs. And so what they need is a great deal of strength and stability to be able to support this mass. So what we see is these hypaxial muscles broadening and fusing into these sheets of muscles. And these sheets of muscles come in multiple layers, one on top of the other, with this very strong band of muscle, the rectus abdominis, coming in ventrally to sort of hold everything very stably together. So we see this in the salamander. We see basically the same arrangement in the cat abdominal musculature. So we've got these layers upon layers of these sheets of muscles with the transversus abdominis internal, followed by the obliques internal and external, and then again the strong rectus abdominis, this band of muscle coming along the ventral midline to hold all that together. So a lot of strong connective tissue. And the other thing you'll notice is that the fiber angles of these sheets of muscles are different in every layer. You can see it best, I think, in the salamander. You've got the transverse muscles running from side to side, obliques running at an angle in one direction, and then the next layer of obliques running in a different direction. And the idea behind this is the same as the idea behind plywood. In plywood, we've got sheets and layers of wood with the grain going in different directions in different layers. And this gives plywood very great strength compared to just having all of the layers with the grain going in the same direction. So this biological design is specialized for providing stable support to hold up the mass of the body up off the ground as it's supported by these legs. So now let's begin to think about these appendicular muscles. So you'll recall that I said in the fish, it's very, very simple. There are just two, one for up and one for down. So we've got abductor muscles dorsally, and these are color-coded in this more bluish green for the dorsal abductor muscles, and then this more yellowy green for the ventral adductor muscles. They're calling them flexors here. It's not actually quite correct. So the abductors and adductors become subdivided and expanded when we get into tetrapods. So if we compare this to the superficial forelimb muscles of a lizard, so we still have this color coding showing the muscle homologies. So we've got a whole group of abductors and extensors that are all derived from that pectoral abductor muscle in the fish. And so specialized to do all of the more complicated support and movement that are required of the limbs as their role changes from basically kind of stabilization of body rotations in fish to being the main locomotor organs in tetrapods. So latissimus dorsi, the deltoid group, as well as the triceps, the main extensor of the forelimb, and all of these extensors going down the dorsal surface of the antebrachium. And then in this more yellowy green, we've got the whole ventral group, including the pectorals, the main adductors of the forelimb, as well as flexors of the forelimb, such as the biceps brachii and the brachialis, and all of these forelimb flexors that you find on the ventral surface of the lower part of the limb. And if we look at the deeper muscles, we see even more subdivision and more muscles coming from these same groups, again color-coded here. We've got the dorsal muscles that come both posterior and anterior to the scapula, which is going to make things very confusing when we get to mammals and that scapula rotates, as we'll see as we move on into mammals. And then again, this ventral group in this more yellowy green, connecting the scapula and the coracoid to the humerus. But it turns out that it's not just those abductors and adductors of the fins in fish that are going to contribute to the appendicular muscles. We actually get contributions from other muscle groups into the appendicular group. So we're going to define appendicular muscles as any muscle that has any attachment, either origin or insertion, on the bones of the appendage. So first of all, we have contributions from branchiomeric muscles. So these are muscles that are associated with the gills in fish. These are derived primarily from the cucullaris muscle here above the constrictor muscles for the gills that function in fish in elevating the entire gill chamber. So hopefully you saw that in your shark and lab. And the muscles that are derived from this cucullaris muscle are the trapezius and mastoid groups. So the trapezius are those superficial muscles along the back that kind of drape over all the other muscles that you saw in your cat. The mastoid groups you didn't see, they're primarily muscles of the neck that we skipped over in lab, and those are also derived from these branchiomeric muscles. We also have contributions from the axial musculature. These create part of that muscular sling that we saw in the forelimb. In the next slide, we'll get more detail of that, but these include the levator scapulae, the rhomboid group, and the serratus ventralis. And then, of course, the dorsal group, which we've just been talking about, that are derived from pectoral abductors, and the ventral group that are derived from the pectoral adductors. To see more details on all of these muscle homologies, you can refer to Table 10.2 in your textbook, and it has all of these derivations very nicely diagrammed for you. But first, let's take a look at the muscular sling. So remember we said that there's no bony connection between the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton in the forelimb. And so we said if we took a scalpel, we could slice that entire forelimb straight off without encountering any kind of bony resistance, just soft tissue. And so these muscles have to be very, very strong to stabilize the forelimb and keep it attached to the axial skeleton. So the main muscles that we're talking about, again, from the axial muscle groups are the rhomboids, attaching to the neural spine and out to the more dorsal tip of the scapula. The serratus ventralis, which I hope you all saw in your cat, that's going to go from the internal part of the scapula and attach down to the ribs If you go back a little posteriorly, it'll attach individually to the different ribs in these little slips or finger-like slips of muscle. And then the branchiomeric contribution, this trapezius, which goes superficial to the rhomboid group, and again, kind of just drapes over the top of the scapula and lashes the scapula to the neural spine of the vertebra. And then finally, from the ventral group, our main abductors of the forelimb, the pectoralis muscle that keeps the humerus attached to the sternum. So these are the muscles that provide that muscular sling in the forelimb, especially in mammals. We also saw that the humerus doesn't have a very strong attachment to the scapula. So the glenoid fossa on the scapula is very, very shallow. And again, we need these groups of strong muscles to hold all of this together. And those are provided by the muscles of the rotator cuff. So this is where things I mentioned get a little bit confusing about the positions. So the supraspinatus and infraspinatus, which you saw very much dorsally on your cat, because of that rotation of the scapula, it turns out that these are actually part of the ventral group. You'll get more information on the evolution of these muscles a little bit later in the web lecture on adaptations for flight in birds and mammals, but these are actually derived from ventral adductors of the forelimb. And then also confusing because of this rotation of the scapula, the subscapularis, which again you saw on the ventral surface of the scapula on your cat, is actually derived from the dorsal group. And this is just because we saw that some of the dorsal muscles came and attached anteriorly onto the scapula, and then when the scapula rotated, it ended up being the ventral surface of the scapula. So complex evolutionary history, making some of these a little bit complicated to figure out just intuitively. And then there's the teres minor, which is a relatively large muscle in the humans, but you probably saw it as a very small muscle in your cat, also derived from the dorsal group. Things are a little bit simpler in the pelvic musculature because you don't have that muscular sling lashing the hind limb onto the axial skeleton. There are direct bony connections between the hind limb and the axial skeleton. So we have still an axial component, but no muscular sling. Just a couple of muscles derived from axial musculature, the subvertebralis and the psoas minor are from the axial group. And then again, the dorsal group derived from pelvic abductors in more or less a simple way, except for the fact that in mammals you get, again, this rotation of the limbs. So one easy way to think about all these groups is to think about where they're located on your own body. But the trick for the leg is that you think of your quadriceps muscles as being very much ventral, right? They're sticking right out in front of you, same direction as your belly. But what you have to do is sort of mentally contort your leg into that sprawled early reptile configuration with your toes pointing out and your knees pointing up, and you'll find that those muscles in the front of your leg are actually dorsal muscles. So again, all of those extensors, your hamstrings, and all those muscles along the front of your leg are actually part of the dorsal group. And then the ventral group, same thing. You think of those as being on the back of your legs, your biceps and your other hamstring muscles, your gastrocnemius, all of these that are flexors of the different segments of your leg are derived from the ventral group. And again, for more details on the specific muscles, see table 10.2. So grouping the muscles in this way is a very nice way of categorizing and remembering the different homologies of these muscles as they evolved from something like a shark through an early tetrapod and then finally to this very complicated state in mammals, and being able to understand how to place these different muscles in functional groups to be able to remember them better. And this can be done either by thinking about their attachment points and thinking when that muscle shortens, what action is it going to have on the skeleton, and also thinking about its placement on the skeleton, ventral or dorsal, to try to remember what the action of that muscle is going to be.